Hi, welcome to my sewing room. I'm super excited to show you how to make a baby quilt out of half square triangles. It's a great project for beginners who are ready to move on to triangles, or for anybody who wants to make something that's quick and fun. Plus, I'll share the quick method I use to make half square triangles to help speed up the process so you can have a quilt finished in no time. Let's dive right in. First things first, let's talk about the materials you're going to need for this quilt. For the method that I'm going to use today, you're going to need 40 5-inch squares out of prints and 40 5-inch squares out of a background fabric. You can use pre-cuts, you can use charm packs, or you can cut your own. For time, I opted to use 2 charm packs, one with colors and another of plain white for my background. If you're going to be cutting your own squares from yardage, you're going to need 5 5-inch strips the width of the fabric for both your prints and your yardage. That comes to about 3/4 of a yard for each. If you like batik fabric, you can also pick up some Island Batik stash builder rolls. These are strips already cut at 5 inches by the width of the fabric. They come in a pack of 5 with 4 strips per roll. I get some of these every year in my Island Batik ambassador box, and they're a lot of fun to play with. When I was making the video, I left out a few shots that I thought were important, so I needed to cut out some more half square triangles. So I decided to use this pink stash builder roll, and I paired it with one more strip from another roll to get me 5 pink strips, and I used those to cut out 40 prints for another version. You will also need 4 2.5-inch strips of the same background color for a border and 4 strips of any print you want for the binding. I like to cut my binding at 2 1/4, but a lot of people like to do 2 1/2, so you can cut yours whatever width you like to work with. The quilt measures 40 by 49, so you'll need a piece of batting big enough to cover that. I used some leftover strips from another project and I made some Franken batting for the perfect size. For the backing, if you're going to quilt it on a domestic machine, you can get away with 1.5 yards of fabric. Since the quilt's only 40 inches, you can probably get away with a 44-inch wide fabric. If you're going to send it to a long armor, you probably need a little bit more yardage so you can add a strip on the side. Long armors need you to have your backing that's at least 6 inches wider than the top. I do quilt mine on a long arm, and I did use a 44-inch strip, but I don't mind working with just a little bit on the side. But don't tell that to your long armor. They need those extra 6 inches. It makes things easier for them, especially if they're quilting it with the computer. They will definitely need those extra inches. Okay, now that we have our fabric, let's talk about cutting. If you're using a charm pack, you don't have to cut anything. But if you are using strips, you'll need to cut 5-inch squares from those strips. And you can get 8 squares from each strip, so that's why you need 5. So you'll cut 40 5-inch squares out of your colorful prints, and then 40 squares from your background print. Let me quickly mention, if you're cutting your squares from scraps, you can make your squares as however big or however small you want. It just depends on how big or small you want your quilt and what kind of layout you want to work with. For example, I made this black and white baby quilt with 3-inch half square triangles. I used 100 half square triangles for a 10 by 10 layout, and with the borders, the quilt came to about a 40-inch square. Once you have all your squares ready, it's time to start making half square triangles. There's lots of different ways you can speed up this method, but the one I'm going to use today is the one that's called draw and sew. So let me show you how I do that. Using a ruler and pencil or a fabric marker, draw a diagonal line from one corner to the other, usually on the lighter fabric. And you always want to do this on the wrong side of the fabric, not the pretty side, so you can see it when you're sewing. Then you'll place your 2 squares right sides together with the drawn line on the top. You'll sew a 1/4-inch seam on both sides of that line. Then you'll cut down the center of the diagonal line, press your seams open, and voila, you have 2 half square triangles. To make this step even faster, you can skip drawing the line and you can use some seam tape, or you can use the lines on your machine. I bought this roll a couple years ago and I still have a lot left. I use it a lot. It's washi tape, so it's not real sticky, so it doesn't stick to the bedding machine and leave any residue. And you can get it from Cluck Cluck Sew. She's the one who sells it. It's really cool. I also have lines on my machine, so I don't draw any lines anymore, and it makes it go even faster. When I made this project, I lined up the top corner of the square with my presser foot. I have a 1/4-inch presser foot, so when I line the top corner here, I know I am a 1/4 away from the needle. I line up the bottom corner with the seam lines on my sewing machine. It did hang over a little, but I could eyeball it good enough to keep the first few stitches on track. As I sewed, I made sure the bottom corner followed the seam lines from the machine and the seam tape. I did that for all my squares, chain piecing all 40 of them. Then I flipped them and sewed the other side in the same way. Once you get the hang of it, it's super quick. This method without the drawing took me 20 minutes to sew all 40 charm squares with both seam lines, and 6 minutes to trim them all, and another 6 minutes to press them open. Another method people like to use that's quick is the 4 at a time method. You take a little bit bigger square and you sew all around the edges, and then you cut it, and then when you open them up, you have 4 triangles. This is good if you want to make your half square triangles out of layer cakes. I don't use this method very often myself. That's just a personal preference. Only because when you cut the triangles open, all the edges now are on the bias, so they're a little bit stretchy. So you have to be careful when you handle them and when you iron them. If not, you end up with some kind of odd polygon shape instead of a square. Once all the chain piecing and the ironing is done, it's time to trim up your squares. I like to trim mine to a perfect 4.5 inches. I've been sewing for a lot of years, but I still tend to end up with some wonky half square triangles from time to time. So I prefer to cut big and trim down. I don't cut too much bigger. Let me tell you the quilting math for half square triangles. If I want a 4-inch finished triangle, I'm going to start with a 5-inch square. If you want to do it, cut it perfect, then you would start with a 4 7/8 inch square. Because when you cut a square 4 7/8, cut it on the diagonal, piece 2 together, sew it perfect, cut it perfect. When you open it up, it's perfect 4.5. But like I said, I don't always get that perfect. So I start with 5 inches and then I'll square it up. And when I start to trim it off, I'm really trimming off just slivers. That 1/8 ends up sometimes being hardly anything because my squares come out wonky. But then I have enough to trim it off and I get my perfect 4.5 inch squares. It does take time to do these. This took me 30 minutes to trim up all my half square triangles, but to me, it's worth it. All right, once all your half square triangles are sewn together and trimmed, it's time to start putting them together. This is one of my favorite parts, watching it grow on the design wall. The first thing I like to do is to put all my squares on the design wall facing the same direction. I'm not really worried about the pattern here, I'm more worried about color placement. I don't want to have all the darks in one side and all the lights on one side. I want to kind of spread them all around. If you don't have a design wall, the back of a flannel tablecloth works perfect. You can tape it up on the wall, put your pieces on there. Sometimes you can even roll it up to store it when you're done and then slowly back unroll it. I used the back of a flannel tablecloth for many years. I didn't get my own dedicated design wall until my daughter moved out and I took over her room, and it's now my sewing space. Once I get all the prints in the color order that I want, then I start turning them into my design. In this case, I opted for the diamond design. It took me about 25 minutes to get everything on the wall and in the order that I wanted it. This may take you a little bit longer depending on what pattern you use and how many half square triangles you have. The pink version that I made actually took me a little bit longer because I only used 5 prints. I didn't want any print touching, so I had to maneuver them around just in the right spot. So that did take just a little bit longer. When the pattern is finally picked out, I double check one more time and make sure that all the darks and all the lights are where I want them and that nothing's really touching each other that just shouldn't be. And then I get ready and I start to sew it. I create the horizontal rows by sewing them in pairs. To do that, I take column 1 off the design wall and stack each half square triangle on top of the next, making sure to keep them in order. I do the same thing for column 2. Then I take the half square triangle from the top of column 1 and I sew it to the top of column number 2. I do this all the way down the row without breaking any thread. That's 10 squares all sewn together because there's 10 rows. After I've sewn all 10, I pull them back and I clip the threads and I put them on top of each other in the order that I sewed them. Some people like to take the whole chain to the ironing board, but I like to clip them. It's really just personal preference, whatever you like to do. When I press them, I want to press row 1 go in one direction and row 2 go in the opposite direction. That way, when I start sewing the rows to each other, the seams nest together super nice and it makes the sewing go a little bit quicker. After I sew each set, I like to put them back on the design wall because sometimes things may get turned around, especially when you're ironing and you're putting things back in order or what you think is order. I've done that lots of times. So I've learned, just put them back on the design wall. It only takes a few seconds and you can make sure that everything is still in the right place. Once the rows are all created, I sew them together in pairs too. I sew them in 2 and then 2 and 2. With this one, you'll have an odd row, but I go ahead and sew that to 1 row. So then I'm really only sewing like half the quilt together when I get to the end, which is nice because I don't have a whole lot of weight pulling on the needle. I only have like half the weight. So that's another reason why I like to sew half and half and half and just I break it down that way. For this quilt, it took me 39 minutes just to create each row. I had 10 rows. It took me another 29 minutes to sew the rows to each other. For the borders, I measure a couple places across the quilt and then I'll take an average of that and then that'll be my border width. And I start with these side borders because then it comes out almost 40.5 inches and then I can just use one whole width of fabric. So for this quilt, I spent 15 minutes cutting the borders and sewing them on. These are my actual sewing times. It may take you a little bit longer, especially if you're a beginner or you don't enjoy assembly line sewing like I do. So depending on your skills or what your preference is, it may take you a little bit longer. If you're just starting out, I suggest taking some breaks in between, pressing all your seams really good, taking a few minutes to stand back and look at the project and soak it all in. I make these quilts with the intention of them being used and worn out, so I'm not going to put a lot of heavy, dense custom quilting into these. I don't want to be getting my rulers out, and I don't want to be marking my quilt, so I usually do an all-over meander. Every now and then I might throw in some custom quilting, but it's only if I don't have to do any of that extra stuff. For example, in the white spaces of this quilt, I did some wavy lines. They are quick and more forgiving than straight lines, plus straight lines take longer because you have to go slower and use rulers. I also opted not to stitch in the ditch because that's also slow, and you have to go slow and make sure you don't hop out of that ditch. To finish it, I did some basic meandering in the printed fabrics. So I have a wee bit of little custom quilting, but not too much. It's just enough to give it some charm. This is a good size to practice free motion quilting on if you like. And if you want to do wiggly lines, if you mess up, it'll just look like a wiggly line. And in this one, if you do meandering, the prints kind of are so busy that if you mess up in the meandering, it'll be hard to see. So this is a nice size for that. The quilting for this one took me 45 minutes. Again, I quilted on a long arm, so I don't have to take time to pin baste it. So if you're pin basting, you'll probably have to add a few more minutes for that. Once it's quilted, you're on the home stretch. All you need to do is trim off the backing and the batting, square it up, and then add your binding. It took me about 25 minutes to do all that for this quilt. So when you add up all the time, it took me about 4 hours to make this baby quilt. Now you can make this in a day if you have a big chunk of time. I actually made this one in a day. But this pink one here, I'm actually splitting it up. I made my half square triangles one day, I pieced the top another day, and then I'm going to quilt it on another day. Just depends on how much time you have and what kind of mood you're in, depending on, all kinds of things of how you want to work on these specific projects. I'm so happy with how these have turned out. I mean, this one's not quite finished yet, but so far I'm liking how it turned out. I want to make it pink for Valentine's Day. I want to have a cute little pink baby quilt. Hopefully this video has given you a realistic idea of how long it actually takes to make a quilt. Of course, you'll need to vary the times a little bit depending on your own sewing style, but hopefully it has shown you, if you need a quick project, do you actually have time to make a quick project? And can you squeeze it into your schedule? I hope you're inspired to make one yourself. And whether you use the quick methods or you want to sew half square triangles individually on your own, either way, it'll turn out beautiful. Thanks so much for watching, and drop me a comment below if you plan to make a half square triangle quilt. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Until next time, happy sewing.